The general stopped speaking mid-sentence. At first, I thought he had simply lost his place in the speech. The ceremony hall was crowded with veterans, officers, and families. The kind of quiet, polished event where everything runs exactly the way it's supposed to. But General Caldwell wasn't looking at the crowd anymore. He was staring at my hand. More specifically, the ring on my finger. His expression changed so quickly, it almost felt like the air shifted around us. The confident four-star general standing at the front of the room suddenly looked like he had just seen something he wasn't prepared for. He stepped down from the stage. People nearby assumed he was greeting guests. A few veterans stood a little straighter when he walked past, but he came straight toward me. When he stopped in front of me, his eyes didn't go to the Marine insignia on my uniform. They didn't go to my rank either. They stayed locked on the ring. "Where did you get that?" His voice was calm, but there was something tight underneath it. I glanced down at my hand. The ring didn't look like anything special, just a dull band of worn metal, the kind of thing most people would overlook. The inside of the band had a small symbol scratched into it, sharp lines forming a shape I had never been able to identify. I'd been wearing it for 3 weeks. No one had asked about it before. "It belonged to my grandfather," I said. The general didn't blink. "What was his name?" "Henry Walker." For a moment, he didn't say anything. He just stared at the ring, like he was confirming something he didn't quite believe. Then he leaned closer and lowered his voice. "We need to talk." That was the moment something inside my chest tightened, because my grandfather, Henry Walker, had been the quietest man I'd ever known, the kind of man most people barely noticed, especially my parents. To them, he was an inconvenience. "I'm Captain Lucas Walker, 32 years old, a Marine Corps officer stationed several states away from the small Colorado town where my grandfather lived. And 3 weeks before that ceremony, my grandfather died alone in a hospital room. My parents never showed up. The call about his collapse didn't even come from them. It came from a neighbor. "Are you related to Henry Walker?" the woman asked over the phone. "Yes." "I think you should come. The ambulance just took him to the county hospital." I packed a bag that night and drove straight through the dark. The hospital hallway smelled like disinfectant and stale coffee. When I gave his name at the nurse's station, the nurse looked relieved. "Your family?" she asked. "Yes." She nodded toward the hallway. "You're the first one who's come." Those words stayed with me. When I walked into the room, Grandpa looked smaller than I remembered. Machines hummed beside the bed, the heart monitor ticking quietly in the background. His eyes opened when he heard the door. For a second, he looked confused. Then he smiled. "Well," he said softly, "looks like someone remembered me." I pulled a chair next to the bed. Of course I did. He studied my face for a moment before asking the question I had been hoping he wouldn't. "Your parents coming?" "I'm sure they will," I said. He didn't argue. He just nodded slowly and closed his eyes again. My grandfather had lived alone for nearly 20 years in a small house outside Redstone Valley, Colorado. The place sat at the edge of town where the mountains started creeping closer to the road. Faded wooden siding, gravel driveway, an old pickup truck that sounded like it might fall apart every time he started it. Most mornings he sat at the same diner booth drinking black coffee. Most afternoons he worked in his garage fixing things people had given up on. Broken radios, rusted lawnmowers, old tools. He had a quiet way of bringing things back to life. When I was a kid, I used to spend summers there. He taught me how to sharpen knives on a stone, how to fix a loose hinge, how to carve little animals out of scrap wood. But if I ever asked about the military, he always said the same thing. That was a long time ago. And then he'd change the subject. 2 days after I arrived at the hospital, he passed away. No dramatic last words, just one long breath. And then silence. When I called my parents afterward, my mother sighed like I had just told her the weather forecast. "Well," she said, "at least he's not suffering anymore." That was the entire conversation. They didn't ask about the funeral. They didn't ask where he'd be buried. They didn't ask about his house or his belongings. So I handled everything myself. The service was small. A priest, the neighbor who called me, an older man who said he once served with Grandpa but didn't explain where, and me. Rain fell lightly while the coffin was lowered into the ground. I remember standing there, staring at the wooden box and feeling something settle in my chest. Not anger, not yet. Just a quiet kind of grief. Later that evening, I went back to Grandpa's house to start packing his things. Most of it was exactly what you'd expect. Old clothes, stacks of newspapers, a dusty toolbox in the garage. But in the back of his bedroom drawer, wrapped inside a faded handkerchief, I found the ring. I remembered seeing it on his hand my entire life. When I was 12, I once asked why he never took it off. He looked down at it for a long time before answering. It reminds me who I am. At the time, I didn't understand what he meant. 3 weeks later, I slipped the ring onto my finger and attended that veteran ceremony. And the moment General Caldwell saw it, the color drained from his face. Standing there in that crowded hall, surrounded by decorated officers and lifelong soldiers, I realized something that didn't make sense. The quiet old man my parents believed had wasted his life had just terrified one of the most powerful generals in the room. And somehow I had the feeling that my grandfather's story wasn't finished yet. For the next few days, I kept telling myself I had imagined it. Not the moment itself. That had happened. A 4-star general had walked off a stage, looked at my grandfather's ring like it carried a ghost inside it, and quietly asked for my name. But I kept trying to explain it away. Maybe the ring belonged to a unit I'd never heard of. Maybe it reminded him of someone else. Maybe grief was making me turn a strange moment into something bigger than it was. The problem was, the more I tried to dismiss it, the more it stayed with me. Life on base didn't slow down just because my head was somewhere else. Morning started before sunrise. Training, reports, drills, meetings. Every hour already belonged to something. Still, the question kept slipping in. I'd be halfway through a briefing and catch my thumb brushing the ring. I'd be standing in formation and feel the edge of the metal against my skin. At night, I started looking at it more carefully. The band was old, worn smooth from years of use. Inside was that same faint symbol I'd noticed before. Sharp, unfamiliar lines cut so lightly into the metal they almost disappeared unless the light hit them just right. I searched for it online once, then again. Nothing. No branch insignia. No old veteran emblem. No intelligence patch from some declassified program. Nothing that explained why a man like General Caldwell had gone pale the second he saw it. About a week later, an email landed in my military inbox. No subject line, just one short message. Captain Lucas Walker, we spoke briefly at the veterans ceremony. I would like to meet with you privately regarding your grandfather. Please contact my office at your earliest convenience. General Thomas Caldwell. I read it twice, then a third time. Not regarding the ring, regarding your grandfather. That phrasing stayed with me. 2 days later, I drove to the address his office sent over. I expected a government building, maybe something tucked behind a gate, something official enough to match the weight in that email. Instead, the GPS led me to a quiet brick building beside a veterans center outside Denver. It almost looked ordinary. An American flag moved lazily by the entrance. A few pickup trucks sat in the lot. The place felt less like power and more like memory. Inside, a receptionist looked up as soon as I walked in. Captain Walker? Yes. He's expecting you. She led me down a narrow hallway and stopped at a closed office door. When she opened it, General Caldwell was standing beside a desk, wearing a dark suit instead of a uniform. No medals, no stage, no microphone. But somehow, he seemed even harder to read like that. Captain, he said. Sir. He motioned toward the chair across from him. I sat. He stayed standing for another second, then his eyes dropped to my hand. You kept wearing it. I looked down at the ring. Yes, sir. He came around the desk slowly and sat across from me. Did your grandfather ever tell you what it was? No. A slight nod. That sounds like Henry. I caught that immediately. You knew him? In a way. That answer did nothing except sharpen the silence between us. In what way? He didn't respond right away. Instead, he opened a drawer and removed a thin file folder. When he set it on the desk, I noticed the redactions before I noticed anything else. Heavy black bars, whole lines erased, names buried, locations gone. It looked less like a document and more like something that had survived a fire. He opened it and turned one page toward me. Most of it was blacked out, but one line remained visible. Primary Operative, H. Walker. For a second, I just stared. My grandfather? Caldwell's face didn't change. Yes. That can't be right. It is. I looked back down at the page. He never talked about his service. That wasn't his decision. I raised my eyes to his. Caldwell leaned back slightly. Captain Walker, are you familiar with the concept of plausible deniability? Yes, sir. Then you understand there are operations a government never intends to officially acknowledge. Men are sent, orders are given, outcomes matter, records disappear. He tapped the file once. Your grandfather was one of those men. The room went still. I had grown up with scraps, half comments, my parents calling him difficult, secretive, a disappointment who never quite fit anywhere. Now a general was telling me the opposite. What did he do? I asked. Caldwell didn't answer that directly. He pointed to my hand. That ring was never a medal. No, I said slowly. I figured that much. It was an identifier. For what? He held my gaze for a moment. Operatives. The word landed hard. You're saying intelligence. I'm saying your grandfather worked in places where uniforms, names, and official records became optional. I leaned back a little, trying to make that fit the man I knew, the one who burned pancakes on Sundays, the one who spent afternoons fixing broken things in his garage. And you recognized it immediately, I said. Yes. How? His expression changed just slightly, not softer, older. Because I once worked around men like him. That answer sat between us for a second. Then he said very quietly, and that ring should not have reappeared. A cold feeling moved through my chest. What does that mean? It means, if it's authentic, it points to work that was supposed to remain buried. I looked at the ring again. Same dull metal, same faint symbol. It had never looked dangerous before. And if someone else sees it? His voice dropped lower. They may start asking questions. Your grandfather spent a lifetime making sure no one asked. Neither of us spoke for a moment after that. Outside the office window, I could see people coming and going from the Veterans Center, old men shaking hands, families helping each other through the parking lot. A normal afternoon. Inside that room, my grandfather's life was quietly coming apart and rearranging itself into something I didn't recognize. Caldwell opened the folder again and slid another page toward me. This is one of the few surviving records attached to his service. I read what was left uncovered. Eastern Europe, 1979, extraction operation. Primary operative, Henry Walker. My throat tightened. He led this? Yes. The answer should have felt impossible. It didn't. It felt worse than that. It felt like something that had been true the whole time while the rest of us were too blind to see it. What kind of extraction? I asked. Intelligence assets. Spies? In plain language, yes. How many? The official report confirms 3. Official? That word caught my attention. I looked up. Official report? Caldwell closed the file halfway and studied me. There were irregularities after the mission. What kind? The kind that don't happen by accident. He stood and walked to the window, clasping his hands behind his back. Records tied to that operation disappeared. Routes, names, safe locations. Enough information to reconstruct the entire mission. Stolen? We never proved that. But you think so. He glanced over his shoulder. I think someone wanted those records gone. A knot started building in my stomach. And you never got them back? No. Then why are you talking to me? He turned fully toward me now. Because for decades, there were only two possibilities. Either those records were destroyed, or someone hid them. My eyes dropped to the ring before I even realized I was doing it. Caldwell noticed. Yes, he said. You're thinking the same thing I am. You think my grandfather took them? I think your grandfather was the last confirmed person with access to them. That wasn't the same answer, but it was close enough. I thought of his house in Redstone Valley, the drawers I'd opened, the closets, the garage, the stack of old newspapers, all the ordinary things I had touched without really seeing. I already went through his house, I said. Caldwell's eyebrow lifted just slightly. You packed his belongings. Yes? That isn't the same thing as searching. I didn't answer because he was right. He opened the folder one last time and turned to a page with even less visible text than the others. Most of it was buried under black ink, but one phrase remained clear. Operation Iron Harbor. The name alone made the room feel heavier. That was his mission? I asked. Yes. What happened? Caldwell came back to the desk and rested his hand lightly on the file. It was considered successful. 3 assets were extracted. And then the files vanished. Yes. I looked at him. So for 40 years, nobody knew what happened to them. He held my gaze. Until now, maybe. I frowned. Because of the ring? Because of the ring, he said. And because Henry Walker was the last man confirmed to have access to everything connected to Iron Harbor. I felt something shift inside me then. Not grief this time. Not shock either. Direction. The old house, the closets, the bedroom, the places I'd searched like a grandson cleaning up after a death, not like someone looking for a secret. Caldwell saw it in my face. You're thinking about going back? Yes. He gave one slow nod. If Henry left anything behind, he said, that's where I would start. I didn't say anything after that. I just looked once more at the blacked-out file on his desk, then at the ring on my hand. For the first time since my grandfather died, I had the distinct feeling he hadn't taken everything with him. The road back to Redstone Valley felt longer than it ever had before, not because of the distance, because every mile gave my mind more time to replay the same thought. If Henry Walker was the last man with access to those files, then there was a chance they never left his hands. The late afternoon sun was dropping behind the mountains when I turned onto the narrow road leading to Grandpa's house. Pine trees lined both sides of the gravel drive, their shadows stretching across the ground like long fingers. The place looked exactly the same as the last time I had been there. Faded wood siding, the same pickup truck parked beside the garage, the porch where he used to sit every evening with a mug of black coffee. Nothing about it suggested secrets. Nothing about it suggested Cold War intelligence operations. And yet my hands tightened on the steering wheel as I parked. For a moment I just sat there, staring at the house. 3 weeks ago, I had walked through that door as a grandson, cleaning up after a funeral. Now I was walking in as someone looking for answers. The front door creaked when I pushed it open. The house smelled faintly of old wood and motor oil, the same smell that had always been there. Grandpa's chair still faced the television in the living room. His reading glasses sat on the small table beside it. For a second, the silence hit harder than it had the first time I came back. When someone dies, the house changes in a way that's hard to explain. It doesn't feel empty. It feels paused. I stepped further inside and closed the door behind me. All right, Grandpa, I muttered quietly. Let's see what you left behind. I started where anyone would. Kitchen drawers, cabinets, the small desk near the window where he kept old repair manuals, bills, receipts. Grocery list, written in his careful handwriting, nothing unusual. I checked the garage next. Tools hung neatly on the wall, organized the way he liked them, screwdrivers lined up by size, wrenches polished from decades of use. The workbench was clear except for a half-disassembled radio. I picked it up, turning it over in my hands. Just a radio, no hidden compartments, no strange markings. I set it back down. Hours passed. The sun dipped lower outside, painting the windows orange. Dust floated lazily through the quiet rooms as I opened drawers and cabinets, checking every envelope, every box, every forgotten corner. Nothing. For a while, I leaned against the kitchen counter, staring down at the ring on my hand. Maybe Caldwell was wrong. Maybe the records really had disappeared. Maybe whatever my grandfather had carried with him died the same day he did. But the thought wouldn't sit right. Henry Walker didn't strike me as the kind of man who left things unfinished. Eventually, I walked down the hallway toward the bedroom. The room looked exactly the way it had when I cleaned it out after the funeral, the bed neatly made. A small dresser against the wall. A faded photograph of the mountains above the headboard. I opened the dresser again. Shirts, sweaters. An old military jacket folded carefully beneath the others. Still nothing. I closed the last drawer and turned toward the closet. The wooden door gave a soft groan as I pulled it open. 3 jackets hung neatly from the rack. A pair of worn boots sat on the floor beneath them. At first glance, everything looked completely normal. But something at the back of the closet caught my eye. The wood panel behind the hanging jackets didn't match the rest of the wall. The grain ran in a different direction. I stepped closer. Maybe it was just a repair job. Old houses had plenty of those. Still, something about it made the back of my neck tighten. I reached out and ran my fingers across the surface. Smooth. Too smooth. The surrounding wood was rough with age. This piece felt newer, almost polished. My pulse picked up slightly. "Come on," I muttered. I pressed my palm against the panel. Nothing happened. For a moment, I felt ridiculous standing there pushing on a wall. Then I tried again. Harder. This time the wood shifted just slightly. A faint click echoed inside the wall. My heart started beating faster. I pushed again. The panel moved inward, just enough to reveal a narrow opening behind it. For a few seconds, I simply stared at it. A hidden compartment inside the wall of my grandfather's bedroom. I reached into the gap and felt something solid. Metal. Carefully, I pulled it out. A small rectangular box. Army green paint scratched along the edges. No markings, no lock, just a simple latch. The weight of it felt heavier than it should have. I carried it to the bed and sat down slowly, the box resting in my hands. For a moment, I hesitated. Opening it felt like stepping into a part of my grandfather's life he had deliberately kept separate from everything else. But curiosity pushed harder than hesitation. I lifted the latch. The lid creaked open. Inside were 3 items. A neatly folded American flag, a small black notebook, and a sheet of paper with several names written across it. My throat tightened slightly. I picked up the notebook first. The cover was worn soft from years of use. When I opened it, the pages were filled with lines of tight handwriting. Not sentences, not stories. Coordinates, dates, short-coded notes. The entries stretched across page after page, different countries, different years. Every few entries had a small symbol drawn beside them. The same symbol etched inside the ring. A cold feeling settled in my stomach. This wasn't a journal. It was a record of operations. Operations that, according to the file Caldwell showed me, weren't supposed to exist. I flipped through several more pages. Some entries had short notes beside them. Contact secured, extraction confirmed, transfer completed. Others had no notes at all. Unfinished. Uncertain. Then one page stopped me completely. At the top, written darker than the rest, were 2 words: Iron Harbor. My breathing slowed. Beneath it were 3 sets of coordinates and 3 dates, each one followed by a short note, the same mission Caldwell had described. Except here it was, written in my grandfather's handwriting. Proof that the operation hadn't vanished completely. It had been sitting in this notebook the entire time. I turned another page slowly, then another. The same symbol appeared again and again beside certain entries. Successful missions. The ring suddenly felt heavier on my hand. I set the notebook down and picked up the sheet of paper from the box. 7 names were written across it. Some of them sounded Eastern European. Next to 3 of the names was a single word: extracted. Those must have been the confirmed rescues. But the final name at the bottom of the page was different. Beside it, in my grandfather's careful handwriting, were 2 words: still alive. I stared at the name. Elena Morova. If that note was accurate, then someone connected to Operation Iron Harbor had survived. Someone intelligence agencies believed had disappeared decades ago. I reached into the box again. A photograph lay beneath the paper. 5 young men stood side by side in dusty military gear. My grandfather was easy to recognize. Even younger, the same calm expression sat on his face. But the man beside him made me freeze. His face looked familiar. It took a second before I realized why. Years later, that same man would appear regularly on television briefings as the director of the CIA. Which meant the quiet old man who taught me how to sharpen knives in his garage had once worked beside people who shaped the Cold War. I leaned back on the bed, staring at the photograph. My parents had spent years describing Grandpa like he was a failure. A stubborn old man who never achieved anything. But the evidence in front of me told a completely different story. I looked back into the metal box. Something else lay folded at the bottom. I pulled it out. A map. An old road map of the western United States, yellowed with age. Highways and towns were marked in faded ink. At first, nothing stood out. Then I saw it. A red circle, drawn in pen around a small town in northern Montana. Next to the circle was a handwritten name: Pine Hollow. My pulse jumped. Grandpa had spent the last 20 years of his life in Colorado. So why mark a town hundreds of miles away? The notebook, the list of names, the photograph. And now the map. Each piece pointed in the same direction. Something connected to Iron Harbor had survived, and my grandfather had known where to find it. I pulled out my phone and scrolled through my contacts until I found Caldwell's number. He had told me to call if I discovered anything unusual. I glanced once more at the red circle on the map. Unusual didn't even begin to cover it. I stepped outside onto the porch and dialed. The line rang twice. Caldwell? It's Walker. A brief pause. Did you find something? Yes. What kind of something? I looked down at the notebook still in my hand. A record, I said. Silence filled the line. Does it mention Iron Harbor? He asked. Yes. Another pause. Longer this time. When he spoke again, his voice had changed. Captain Walker, he said slowly. That notebook may be the only surviving record of that mission. I figured you'd say that. You'll need to bring it to me. I will, I said. Then I glanced at the map again. But there's something else. What? A location. What location? A small town in Montana, his voice sharpened. Name? I looked at the red circle. Pine Hollow. The silence that followed lasted several seconds. Then Caldwell spoke again, and the tone in his voice told me everything had just become much bigger. Captain Walker, he said quietly, if your grandfather marked that town, then Operation Iron Harbor may not be finished. The metal box sat on the passenger seat the entire drive to Denver. I kept glancing at it every few minutes like it might suddenly disappear if I looked away too long. 40 years. That was how long those items had been hidden behind the wall in my grandfather's closet. 4 decades of silence sitting inside a green box that now rattled quietly every time the truck hit a bump in the road. The highway stretched flat and empty across the plains, mountains fading behind me in the rearview mirror. And the whole time, one thought kept circling in my head. Still alive. Those 2 words beside Elena Morova's name refused to leave me alone. If my grandfather had written that decades ago, then he believed something the rest of the intelligence world didn't, which meant he had known something they didn't know. And if Caldwell was right, that knowledge might still matter. By the time I reached the Veterans Center outside Denver, the sky had already turned the pale gray of late afternoon. The same American flag moved slowly beside the entrance, snapping softly in the wind. The building looked as ordinary as it had before, but this time I knew what I was carrying inside. The receptionist recognized me immediately. "Captain Walker?" "Yes." "He's waiting for you." She led me past the same hallway as before, but instead of the office we'd met in earlier, she stopped at a larger door near the end of the corridor. When she opened it, I noticed something different right away. General Caldwell wasn't alone. 2 older men were already sitting at the conference table. Both looked to be somewhere in their 70s, dressed in civilian clothes, but their posture gave them away instantly. Straight backs, quiet eyes, the kind of stillness you see in men who spent most of their lives in uniform. Caldwell stood when I entered. "You brought it." I placed the metal box carefully on the table. "Yes, sir." For a moment, none of them spoke. Then Caldwell lifted the lid. He removed the notebook first. The 2 older men leaned closer as he flipped through the pages, their eyes moving quickly across the lines of numbers and coordinates. Several minutes passed without a word. Finally, one of the men let out a slow breath. "He kept records," the man said. Caldwell nodded slightly. "Better records than most operatives ever would." The second man turned his attention toward me. "You're Henry Walker's grandson?" "Yes." He studied my face for a few seconds, almost like he was comparing it to a memory. Then he gave a small nod. "Your grandfather saved a lot of lives." Hearing that from someone who clearly understood the world Grandpa had lived in made the words feel heavier than any compliment. Caldwell continued turning pages. Then he stopped. "This entry," he said quietly. He rotated the notebook so I could see it. October 22nd, 1979. Below the date were coordinates, and beneath those coordinates was a single name. Covellino. I looked up. Who was that? Caldwell closed the notebook gently. He was the final intelligence asset extracted during Operation Iron Harbor. One of the 3 rescues? Yes. And he survived? Caldwell nodded once. More than that. He reached into the box and pulled out the photograph I had found earlier. "That man," he said, pointing toward one of the figures in the picture, later provided intelligence that prevented several Cold War confrontations from escalating. I blinked. "You're saying my grandfather helped stop a war?" "In a way." The room went quiet again. Caldwell reopened the notebook and flipped several pages forward. "That entry isn't the one we're worried about," he said. He turned the book again so I could see another page. Near the bottom was a name written smaller than the others. Elena Morova. Beside it were the same 2 words I had seen the night before. Still alive. Caldwell looked up. For 40 years, intelligence agencies believed she died during that mission. But my grandfather didn't, I said. One of the older men leaned forward. Henry Walker was the last operative scheduled to meet her before the extraction point. My chest tightened. You mean he was supposed to bring her out? Yes. What happened? The safe house was compromised before the meeting, the man said. She disappeared. Caldwell tapped the notebook lightly. And yet Henry wrote this. Still alive. I stared at the page again. So he knew something no one else did. That's the most likely explanation, Caldwell said. The second man spoke again. For decades, we assumed Elena Morova died behind Soviet lines. And now? I asked. Caldwell closed the notebook slowly. Now we have evidence suggesting she may have escaped, and that my grandfather helped her. That is one possibility. My mind started running through the implications. If Morova had survived, then she might have carried intelligence no one ever recovered. And if someone else discovered that now, the consequences could ripple far beyond a forgotten Cold War operation. Caldwell reached into the box and pulled out the map. He unfolded it across the table. The red circle around Pine Hollow stood out immediately. All three men studied it in silence. Then Caldwell looked up at me. Your grandfather marked this location himself? Yes. He leaned back in his chair slowly. That changes things. How? For 40 years, Iron Harbor was documented as a mission with 3 successful extractions. He tapped the red circle with his finger. But now we have reason to believe there may have been a 4th. The room suddenly felt smaller. A 4th extraction? Caldwell nodded. One that never appeared in any official report. My eyes drifted back to the notebook, back to Elena Morova's name, back to the words beside it. Still alive. Which meant something extraordinary. My grandfather hadn't just participated in the mission, he had finished it, and no one else had known. For several seconds, none of us spoke. Finally, Caldwell folded the map again. This town, he said, was never mentioned in any intelligence report tied to Iron Harbor. I leaned forward slightly. Then mark it. One of the older men answered. Because small towns like that are perfect relocation sites. You mean witness protection? Something similar, he said. During the Cold War, intelligence agencies sometimes relocated assets in places where they could disappear quietly. The explanation made sense. A small town, no attention, no questions. The kind of place someone could build a completely new life. Caldwell looked down at the notebook again. If Elena Morova survived, there's a strong chance she ended up somewhere like Pine Hollow. And my grandfather knew where, I said. Yes. But he never told anyone. Caldwell gave a faint shrug. That wasn't unusual for operatives of that era. Why? Because protecting the asset often mattered more than reporting the details. I leaned back in my chair. So he kept the secret. For 40 years. Caldwell stood and walked toward the window. Outside, a few veterans were walking slowly across the parking lot, helping one another down the steps. He watched them for a moment before speaking again. How far is Pine Hollow from Redstone Valley? About 6 hours by road? He nodded slowly. Close enough for him to visit if he needed to. The thought made something twist in my chest. You think he stayed in contact with her? It's possible, Caldwell said. Men who save someone's life rarely forget about them. One of the older men added quietly, There's another possibility. What's that? I asked. Your grandfather may have relocated her there himself. The room fell silent again. If that was true, then Henry Walker hadn't just completed a mission. He had given someone a completely new life. Caldwell returned to the table. For decades, he said, intelligence agencies wondered what happened to Elena Morova. He tapped the red circle on the map once more. And the answer may have been sitting in that small town the entire time. I stared at the map. The circle no longer looked like a simple mark. It looked like a message, a final clue my grandfather had left behind. Caldwell folded the map carefully. We need to go there. You mean Pine Hollow? Yes. When? As soon as possible. I nodded slowly. Everything about this story had started with a strange moment at a ceremony. Now it had turned into something far bigger. A hidden mission, a missing intelligence asset, and a town my grandfather had marked decades earlier. Later that evening, I drove back to Redstone Valley to gather a few things before the trip. The house looked the same as always, quiet, still. The metal box sat on the kitchen table where I had left it. I picked up the photograph again. 5 young men standing in dusty military uniforms, my grandfather among them. They looked like a team that had been through something dangerous together, men who trusted each other with their lives. Yet my grandfather had spent the rest of his life pretending that part of his story never existed. I stepped out onto the porch. The mountains were dark against the fading sky. This was the same place he used to sit every evening with a cup of coffee, watching the sun drop behind the trees. For most of my life, I thought those quiet evenings meant he had moved on from the past. Now I wondered if he had simply been carrying it alone. A mission the world believed had failed. A woman whose life depended on a secret he refused to share. The next morning before sunrise, I met General Caldwell in the parking lot outside the Veterans Center. He climbed into the passenger seat of my truck and unfolded the map once more. The red circle around Pine Hollow stood out in the pale morning light. "If your grandfather marked this town," Caldwell said quietly, "there's a reason." I started the engine. The highway stretched out ahead of us. And somewhere in northern Montana, a small town might finally reveal what really happened at the end of Operation Iron Harbor. By the time we crossed into Montana, the sky had opened wide and pale above us. Miles of highway cut through pine forests and long stretches of open land, the kind of country that makes everything feel small, including the questions you've been carrying, until one of them suddenly matters more than anything else. General Caldwell sat beside me with the folded map resting on his knee. For most of the drive, neither of us said much. There wasn't really anything left to speculate about. We had a town. We had a name. We had a dead man's secret pointing us north. And somewhere inside all of that, we had the truth. Pine Hollow appeared just after midday. It was even smaller than I had imagined. One main road, a gas station, a grocery store with a weathered sign, a few scattered buildings that looked like they had been standing there for 50 years, without anyone seeing a reason to replace them. Across from the store sat a diner called Mountain View Cafe. Caldwell looked out the window as I parked. "Places like this," he said quietly, "are easy to disappear into." I killed the engine. Or easy to protect someone in. He glanced at me but didn't answer. Inside, the diner smelled like coffee, grease, and old wood. A couple of locals sat near the windows, talking low over breakfast plates. Behind the counter, an elderly waitress was refilling mugs with the kind of relaxed rhythm that comes from doing the same work in the same place for years. She looked up when we entered. "You two just passing through?" "Something like that," Caldwell said. We took seats at the counter and ordered coffee first, like men trying not to make the room nervous. The waitress poured it and moved on, but I could feel my pulse picking up anyway. I reached into my jacket and took out the photograph from the metal box. The old picture slid onto the counter between us. "Ma'am," I said, "have you ever seen this woman before?" She adjusted her glasses and leaned in. For several seconds, she said nothing. Her eyes moved slowly across the faces in the picture. Then her expression changed. Not dramatically, just enough. "Well," she said under her breath, "I'll be." Caldwell straightened slightly beside me. "You recognize her?" The waitress tapped one finger lightly near the photograph. "Yes." My chest tightened. "What was her name?" Caldwell asked. The woman hesitated. "That depends." I frowned. "What do you mean?" The name she used here wasn't that one. Caldwell and I exchanged a quick look. "What name did she use?" I asked. The waitress looked at me over the rims of her glasses. "Margaret Cole." For a second, all I heard was the soft hiss of the grill in the kitchen. Margaret Cole. Not Elena Morova. Not missing. Not dead. Renamed. Replanted. "How long did she live here?" Caldwell asked. The waitress thought for a moment. "Close to 30 years. 30. I looked down at the photograph again. That meant my grandfather hadn't just gotten her out. He had kept her hidden long enough for her to become someone else. "Is she still in town?" I asked. The waitress's face softened. "No, honey. She passed some years back." The words landed harder than I expected. We had come all this way looking for the final missing piece, only to arrive after it had already been buried. "She was a good woman," the waitress said, wiping the counter with a folded towel. "Quiet, kept to herself, worked over at the library." A library? I don't know why that detail stayed with me, but it did. Maybe because it sounded so ordinary. So far from extraction routes and covert operations and erased records. "Did she ever talk about where she came from?" Caldwell asked. The waitress shook her head. "No, not really. She wasn't the type to volunteer much." Then she paused. But one time, she did mention a man who helped her start over. My eyes snapped up. "Did she say who?" The waitress leaned closer to the photo again, then lifted one finger and pointed directly at my grandfather. Him. The room around me seemed to go strangely still. For years, intelligence files had treated Elena Marova like a vanished problem. A missing asset, a dead end. But she hadn't vanished. She had lived in this tiny town under another name, shelving books, drinking coffee, and waking up each morning with a life my grandfather had protected in complete silence. "You knew Margaret?" the waitress asked. Caldwell answered before I could. "In a way." The woman nodded as if that was enough. "She used to sit over there every morning." She pointed toward a booth by the front window. "Tea, not coffee. Always had a book with her. Never caused trouble. Never talked too much. Just lived her life. Exactly the kind of life someone would fight to preserve by keeping the truth buried." Caldwell stood first. "Thank you," he said. As we turned toward the door, the waitress called after us. "If you're looking for where she's buried, the cemetery's just outside town." A few minutes later, we were standing on a hillside above Pine Hollow. The cemetery was small, quiet. Wind moving through the grass, pine trees swaying beyond the fence line. Nothing dramatic, nothing grand. We walked row by row until we found the headstone. Margaret Cole, 1946 to 2018. That was all. No trace of the name Elena Marova. No sign that the woman buried there had once been at the center of an operation people in Washington had spent decades trying to understand. I stood there staring at the stone while the wind pressed lightly against my jacket. Caldwell exhaled beside me. "Your grandfather pulled it off." I kept my eyes on the grave. "Yes." "He gave her the life she was supposed to have." That was when something inside me shifted. Until that moment, I had still been looking at the story like a mystery. Missing records, hidden identities, covert missions. But standing there in front of that grave, the truth felt simpler than that. My grandfather hadn't kept the secret because he was hiding from the world. He kept it because the secret itself was the protection. If the wrong people had known she survived, then her life never would have become this quiet, never would have become real. "She wasn't a file to him," I said quietly. Caldwell glanced at me. "No," he said. "She was a person." We stood there in silence a while longer. The town sat below us, small and unremarkable under the afternoon sun. To everyone in Pine Hollow, Margaret Cole had probably been exactly what she seemed. A librarian, a neighbor, a woman who liked tea and books and routine. And that, I realized, was the whole point. Caldwell finally spoke again. "I spent 3 decades in intelligence," he said. "Very few operations end like this." "How do they usually end?" He gave a faint, humorless smile. "Paperwork, commendations, classified archives. Sometimes a flag on a coffin." I looked back at the headstone. My grandfather didn't get any of that. "No," Caldwell said. Then he looked down toward the town. "Because if he had, she wouldn't have gotten this." A quiet life, a library job, a grave under another name, a future. The wind picked up for a moment, brushing through the grass around us. Then Caldwell said something else. "There's one more thing." I turned toward him. "If Henry brought her here," he said, "then he almost certainly knew where she was all these years." I looked back at the grave. "You think he came to see her?" "It's possible." The idea struck me in a way I hadn't expected. All those quiet years in Redstone Valley, all those evenings on the porch, all those long silences I had mistaken for emptiness. Maybe he hadn't been alone in the way I thought. Maybe somewhere within driving distance had been the one person on Earth who knew exactly what he had done, and why. That thought stayed with me as we walked back to the truck. I turned once more before getting in. For 4 decades, Elena Marova had existed in the minds of intelligence officers as an unresolved question. Now she was no longer a question. She was Margaret Cole, and because of my grandfather, she got to stay that way until the end. The drive back south was quieter, not tense this time, heavier. As if the truth, once found, had settled into the truck with us and no longer needed to announce itself. Hours passed before Caldwell spoke again. "You understand what Henry figured out, don't you?" I kept my eyes on the road. "What do you mean?" "The safest way to hide something important," he said, "is to let the world believe it was never there." I glanced down at the ring on my hand. The faint symbol inside caught a sliver of late sunlight. For weeks I had thought of it as a key to a secret. Now I understood it differently. It wasn't only a marker of hidden service. It was a reminder of a particular kind of courage, the kind that doesn't ask to be seen. By the time we crossed back into Colorado, the sun was beginning to drop behind the ridges. The mountains near Redstone Valley appeared in the distance, dark against the evening sky. When I pulled over near the Veterans Center and Caldwell climbed out, he paused before closing the door. He looked at me for a long moment. "Your grandfather would be proud of you." I didn't answer right away. "I hope so." Caldwell nodded once, then rested one hand on the open truck door. "For the first time in 40 years, he said, someone knows how Iron Harbor really ended." He shut the door and stepped back. I watched him walk away, then looked down at the ring again. The mystery was over. But what it left behind felt bigger than any medal my grandfather never received. The cemetery outside Redstone Valley was quiet that morning. Not the kind of quiet that feels empty, the kind that feels settled. A thin breeze moved through the grass, carrying the smell of pine down from the hills. The mountain sat in the distance, pale blue against the early sunlight. I stayed in the truck for a minute before stepping out. Everything felt different now. For most of my life, Henry Walker had simply been my grandfather, the quiet old man who lived alone at the edge of town, fixed broken tools in his garage, and drank coffee on the porch every evening. The man my parents never seemed to have much patience for. But standing there, with the ring on my finger, I knew something they hadn't known. That quiet life had been earned. I walked across the grass slowly until I reached his grave. The headstone was simple. Henry Walker, 1941 to 2024. No mention of medals, no mention of missions, just his name. For a while I didn't say anything. I just stood there looking down at the stone while the wind moved softly through the trees behind me. I thought about everything we had uncovered. The hidden compartment in the closet, the notebook filled with coordinates, the names of people pulled out of places they were never supposed to escape from. And a woman who lived 30 years in a quiet Montana town because my grandfather chose to keep his mouth shut. Most people will never know stories like that exist. They'll never see the quiet sacrifices that happen far away from cameras or history books. But that never seemed to bother him. What mattered was the result. Elena Marova survived. She lived a full life, and apparently that had been enough. Footsteps in the grass made me turn. My parents were walking toward me. For a moment, none of us spoke. My father stopped beside the grave and stared down at the headstone the same way I had. The wind pushed lightly against his jacket. Finally, he said something I never expected to hear. "I spent most of my life thinking your grandfather wasted his." He paused. Then he shook his head slightly. I was wrong. My mother stepped forward and placed a small white flower beside the stone. We never understood him, she said quietly. I looked down at the ring on my hand before answering. No, I said. We didn't. For a while, we just stood there together. No arguments, no explanations, just the sound of the wind moving through the trees and a truck passing somewhere on the road beyond the hill. Eventually, my father glanced down at my hand. That ring, he said. It was his? Yes. He wore it all the time. I nodded. He once told me it reminded him who he was. My father looked back at the headstone again. I think I finally understand what he meant. Later that afternoon, I went back to Grandpa's house one last time. The same house that had seemed so small when I first arrived weeks earlier now felt different. Not bigger, just clearer. The metal box sat on the kitchen table where I had left it. Inside were the things that carried his secret for 40 years. The notebook, the photograph, the list of names. The map that led us to Pine Hollow. I picked up the photograph again. 5 young men standing together in dusty uniforms. One of them my grandfather. They looked young, focused, like men who knew exactly what they had stepped into. But when that part of his life ended, he hadn't carried it around like a trophy. He walked away from it. No stories. No recognition. Just a quiet house in the mountains and a life that looked ordinary from the outside. I placed the photograph back inside the box and closed the lid. Some stories aren't meant to become headlines. Some things are done simply because they're the right thing to do. Before leaving, I stepped out onto the porch. The same porch where Grandpa used to sit every evening with a cup of coffee, watching the sun disappear behind the hills. For years, I thought those quiet evenings meant he had nothing left to do. Now I realized something else. He had already done the work that mattered. The ring caught the sunlight when I lifted my hand. For most of my life, it had just been a piece of metal. Now it meant something different. Not a symbol of secrets, a reminder of a kind of courage most people will never notice. The kind that changes lives quietly and then asks for nothing in return. Before driving out of town that evening, I stopped by the cemetery one more time. I didn't stay long. I just rested my hand briefly on the cool stone of the headstone. You did good, Grandpa, I said. The wind moved gently across the grass. No answer came. But somehow, that felt right. Because Henry Walker had never needed the last word. He had already said everything that mattered with the life he lived. And if there's one thing I learned from uncovering his story, it's this. The world is full of quiet people whose lives carry more meaning than anyone realizes. People who do the right thing and then walk away. My grandfather was one of them. And now, at least one person knows the truth he protected for 40 years. What would you have done if you were in his place?